some people can't understand why we should actually enjoy splitting up. I only got my quota of 1 or 2 tunes per album. It was sort of trying to push in a bit.
George Harrison was known as the quiet Beatle calm, gentle and almost mystical. But behind that serene image, Harrison carried grudges that burned for decades. He once admitted there were people he would never forgive, names that stretched from his childhood idol to his own bandmates, from rock legends to flashy superstars. Some mocked his music, some dismissed his spirituality, and some simply betrayed his trust. But one name stood out above them all, the person George truly hated more than anyone else. Who was it? And what drove him to such lasting resentment? Before we dive into the untold story of George Harrison's deepest grudges, make sure you hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear may change how you see the quiet Beatle forever. To the world, George Harrison was the quiet Beatle. He was the one with the calm smile, the spiritual aura, the man who seemed untouched by the chaos of fame. The press built an image of serenity around him, someone who let John and Paul fight for the spotlight while he stayed in the background, strumming away. But that image, as peaceful as it looked, was only half the truth. Inside, Harrison was anything but passive. Beneath the quiet exterior lived a man who carried grudges like battle scars, a man who rarely forgot a slight and who refused to forgive what he saw as betrayal or fakery. From his earliest days in Liverpool, George struggled to be taken seriously. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, and he didn't try to be, but he had a sharp memory, and he noticed every time someone underestimated him. Even within the Beatles, the resentment grew. His songs were often pushed aside, his ideas dismissed, and his contributions overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney's dominance. For George, it wasn't just about music. It was about being constantly undervalued, even in the band he helped build. The nickname Quiet Beatle became more of a cage than a compliment. It suggested he was meek, when in reality he was boiling with frustration, quietly tallying the list of people who had let him down. And this bitterness didn't fade with time. It hardened into grudges that would last for decades, sometimes flaring up in brutal honesty during interviews or private conversations. George Harrison may have been quiet on stage, but behind closed doors, his opinions cut deep. But the first wound didn't come from inside the Beatles. It came from the man Harrison once worshipped, the rock and roll king who turned into his biggest disappointment. For young George Harrison, music wasn't just entertainment, it was electricity in his veins. And no one sparked that current more than Elvis Presley. As a teenager pedaling through Liverpool, George once stopped his bike outside a house and heard Heartbreak Hotel drifting through the window. That moment lit a fire inside him. Elvis wasn't just a singer. He was a symbol of freedom, rebellion, and everything exciting about rock and roll. From then on, George followed his every move, studying the swagger, the guitar, the voice that seemed to shake the world. Throughout the Beatles' rise, Elvis remained his idol. George often spoke of how Elvis had changed everything. And when the Beatles themselves became icons, finally crossing paths with the king of rock and roll should have been a dream come true. But reality rarely lives up to fantasy. By the 1970s, the Elvis George met was no longer the leather-clad rebel of the 50s. Instead, he found a man in glittering jumpsuits, backed by brass sections and endless backup singers, a Vegas spectacle, polished and overblown. To George, it felt hollow. He later sighed to friends that he just wanted Elvis to strip it all back, put on jeans and a black shirt, and sing the raw classics like, "That's All Right, Mama." That was the Elvis he had worshipped, the one who had inspired him to pick up a guitar. But the criticism didn't stay private. Word of George's comments reached Elvis himself, who was said to smirk coldly and mutter, "If he thinks I'm going back to little bars just to please him, he doesn't know Elvis Presley." In that moment, the bond between idol and disciple shattered. What had once been awe turned into disillusionment, and for Elvis, irritation at a younger musician daring to judge him. For George, the pain of seeing his hero fall from grace lingered, but disillusionment with idols was only the beginning, because his next battle wasn't with a legend on the outside, it was with someone much closer, a brother who became his rival inside the Beatles. In the earliest days of the Beatles, George Harrison and Paul McCartney were inseparable. They were just two Liverpool kids riding the same bus, guitars in hand, bonded by the same obsession with music. Paul even referred to George as his kid brother, and for a time, that's exactly what they were, two dreamers pushing each other forward, figuring out chords late into the night until their fingers were raw. That bond helped shape the Beatles' foundation. But as fame grew, so did the cracks. By the time Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was released in 1967, Paul's influence in the band was unmistakable. He wasn't just contributing songs, he was steering the ship. McCartney became the dominant creative force, often dictating arrangements and brushing aside contributions from others. For George, who was maturing into a songwriter in his own right, it was a suffocating reality. Time and again, his songs were pushed to the margins or relegated to B-sides. The resentment boiled over during the recording of Abbey, wrote in 1969. George fiercely defended his material from Paul's constant suggestions. He even delivered one of his most famous lines, "I'd rather have Willie Weeks play bass than Paul McCartney." It wasn't that George denied Paul's talent. He openly called him a great bass player. But to him, Paul's controlling nature was unbearable. George wanted freedom, not to be treated like a junior partner in the very band he helped build. Even after the Beatles split, the tension lingered. In a 1974 interview, George went so far as to say Paul had ruined him as a guitar player. Yet strangely, amid all the bitterness, George admitted there was still a bond between them, something invisible but unshakable. He once said, "No matter what we've been through, there's always something that ties us together." It was a complicated mix, affection rooted in shared history, but frustration that never fully healed. And if his fractured relationship with Paul was painful, what came next cut even deeper. Because John Lennon, once another hero, became a thorn that George could never quite pull out. In the beginning, George Harrison looked up to John Lennon with the wide-eyed admiration of a younger brother. John had the wit, the swagger, the ability to command a room with just a smirk or a line of verse. To teenage George, Lennon was the fearless leader he could follow. But as the Beatles' fame exploded, that admiration began to unravel, replaced by a steady stream of slights and dismissals that George never forgot. Lennon had little patience for George's growing ambitions as a songwriter. When George proudly presented a new demo, John once shrugged and said, "It's fine, but it's not something I'd listen to." Comments like that stung deeply. George wasn't seeking praise, he wanted respect. And respect was the one thing Lennon seemed unwilling to give him. The clash went beyond music. George's fascination with Indian spirituality, meditation, and mysticism became a vital part of his life. But Lennon often mocked it. During one recording session, when George tried to explain the meaning of a lyric, Lennon cut him down with a sharp, "Don't start telling me about those Indian saints again." To George, this wasn't just dismissal. It was an attack on something sacred. By the final years of the Beatles, the relationship had hardened into cold distance. Their conversations, once filled with wit and energy, became transactional and strained. In his memoir, I, Me, Mine, George barely mentioned Lennon at all. That silence spoke volumes. When asked why, George simply said, "Some things don't need to be mentioned." It was as if erasing Lennon from the page was the final word in their feud. Even after John's tragic death, George didn't soften his stance. He mourned, yes, but he never pretended their friendship had been something it wasn't. For Harrison, the wounds remained raw. Lennon had been both idol and disappointment, a source of inspiration and of pain. And if his frustrations with John Lennon were bitter, George's next target revealed a side of him few had seen before, a rare moment when his calm exterior cracked into outright disdain for another artist's very voice. George Harrison was rarely blunt in public. He usually spoke with calm restraint, letting his sharp opinions slip only in private. But in 1992, during a casual conversation in the studio with Bob Geldof, Harrison stunned everyone by aiming his harshest words at one of rock's most respected figures, Neil Young. When asked his opinion, George didn't hesitate. "I'm not a Neil Young fan. I hate it. Yeah, I can't stand it." It wasn't just a passing remark. George zeroed in on what bothered him most, Young's voice. "I like a couple of his songs," he admitted, "but I hate that voice worse than mine." For a man as reserved as George, this was unusually savage. And he didn't stop there. He mimicked Neil Young's trademark guitar style right there in the studio, sneering, "It's just laughable." He does a solo in the middle of a song, and I look at Eric and say, "What's that about?" Those words didn't stay private for long. Later that same year, fate placed George and Neil side by side on stage at Bobfest, the 30th anniversary concert for Bob Dylan. The event gathered legends from every corner of rock. But backstage, the tension between the two men was unmistakable. George kept his distance, barely making eye contact. Neil, of course, had already heard the rumors of George's insults. Yet Neil Young's reaction was telling. Instead of firing back, he brushed it off with grace. "Everyone's entitled to an opinion," he told reporters. "I didn't like certain artists when I first heard them either. Time changes how you see things." On stage, Neil even stood close to George, smiling as if nothing had happened. George, meanwhile, remained polite but distant, unwilling to mend the rift. This feud wasn't about betrayal or rivalry. It was about pure taste. George simply couldn't tolerate Neil's style, and he was unafraid to say so. But his next target wasn't just about music. It struck at something deeper. The clash between spiritual sincerity and what he saw as dangerous pretense. If George Harrison had one unshakable belief, it was that music and spirituality could never be separated. To him, songs were prayers set to melody, a way of reaching for something higher. And nothing angered him more than when he felt those sacred ideals were being faked. That's why his clashes with Pete Townshend of The Who went far beyond music. They cut to the very soul of what art should stand for. Townshend was one of rock's most flamboyant icons, famous for his windmill guitar style and his thunderous energy on stage. He also embraced the spiritual themes, weaving the teachings of Indian guru Meher Baba into The Who's rock opera Tommy. To fans, it looked like Pete and George shared the same spiritual path, but George didn't buy it. In fact, he openly dismissed Townshend as a pretender. In a 1966 interview with India Today, Harrison said flatly, "Every time I've met him, he's been stoned, talking rubbish. I don't think he's serious about all that religion stuff." For George, it was unforgivable. Spirituality was not a costume to be worn on stage. It was a lifelong discipline. Seeing someone he considered insincere cheapen, those ideals felt like a betrayal, not just of faith, but of music itself. The animosity didn't end there. Offstage, another personal thread deepened the tension. Townshend had quietly aided Eric Clapton in his pursuit of Pattie Boy George's first wife. That affair inspired Clapton's legendary song Layla, but it left scars on Harrison's personal life that never healed. Though George never publicly blamed Townshend, the shadow of that betrayal hovered in the background. To George, Townshend represented everything he despised: flash over substance, preaching ideals without living them, and crossing personal lines that couldn't be ignored. Their conflict was less about guitars and more about truth versus pretense. And when the 1990s brought a new wave of British rock stars, hailed as the next Beatles, George's patience for pretenders ran out entirely. That's when Liam Gallagher of Oasis became his next and most public target. By the 1990s, a new generation of British rockers had claimed the stage, and none shouted louder than Oasis. The press branded them the heirs to the Beatles, a label that carried both enormous weight and constant comparison. For fans, it was a thrilling idea. The Fab Four had finally found their successors. But for George Harrison, the whole thing was a farce. He wasn't impressed, and he certainly wasn't flattered. At the center of Oasis stood Liam Gallagher, the band's outspoken frontman. With his brash attitude, swagger, and constant headlines, Liam embodied the chaos of Britpop. But in George's eyes, he was nothing more than noise. In a 1996 interview, Harrison cut him down with surgical precision. He seems a bit out of date and rather silly. I think it's been proven when you see the band without him holding a microphone. He's just excess baggage. That one line sent shockwaves through the music press. To dismiss one of the UK's biggest stars as excess baggage was more than just criticism. It was a public humiliation. And true to form, Liam Gallagher didn't take it quietly. He fired back on MTV News, calling George a clown and saying that if he ever saw him in person, he'd tell him to his face. He accused Harrison of being the one who was truly out of touch, hiding behind old glories while Britpop carried the torch forward. The feud became a headline war, symbolizing the growing gap between the Beatles' generation and the brash new wave of rock. For older fans, Harrison's dismissal rang true. Oasis could never live up to the Beatles. For younger fans, Liam's rebellion was proof that Oasis had the spirit of rock defiance. But for George, it wasn't about chart positions or generational battles. It was about honesty. He didn't see greatness in Oasis, just hype and bluster. And if calling it out meant igniting a public feud, so be it. Still, Harrison's most complicated feud wasn't with a loudmouthed frontman. It was with a superstar he knew personally. A man whose friendship was as cold as it was caring, Elton John. On the surface, George Harrison and Elton John looked like friends. They'd performed together, appeared at the same parties, and smiled for the cameras. To the public, their relationship seemed warm, even brotherly. But behind those polite moments was a much frostier reality. George didn't actually think much of Elton's music, and he wasn't afraid to say so. In a 1976 interview, Harrison delivered a blow that cut deep. Elton John's music is something I've never thought much of. Every song sounds the same. I think he wrote one good song many years ago. It wasn't just a casual jab. It was a dismissal of one of the most successful hitmakers of the era. To George, Elton's formula of 4 chords and glittering production was hollow, a factory line compared to the raw sincerity he valued in music. Yet the relationship was complicated. Despite the criticism, Elton never lashed out publicly. In fact, he often spoke of George with respect, calling him the wise man of the Beatles, someone who had found meaning beyond fame. And in private, George showed another side. At a party in the late 70s, he reportedly looked Elton in the eye and said bluntly, "For God's sake, cut down on that marching powder." He was one of the few in Elton's circle, honest enough to confront him about his lifestyle, not as a critic, but as a concerned friend. This strange, dynamic, harsh dismissal of his music, but genuine concern for the man defined their connection. It wasn't warm, it wasn't easy, but it was real. George wasn't interested in flattering people for the sake of appearances. If he thought you were wasting your talent or losing your way, he would say it, no matter how much it stung. Their friendship was cold yet caring, distant yet brutally honest. And in that contradiction lies the truth about George Harrison himself, a man who valued sincerity above everything, even if it meant hurting the people closest to him. But when you look at all these grudges together, a bigger question emerges: what do they reveal about the so-called quiet Beatle? George Harrison will always be remembered as the quiet Beatle. But as we've seen, quiet never meant weak, passive, or easygoing. Behind the calm image was a man who carried sharp opinions, long grudges, and an uncompromising sense of honesty. His heroes and friends often let him down. Elvis Presley went from rebel idol to Vegas showman, and George never forgave the loss of authenticity. Paul McCartney, once his closest musical brother, became a rival who overshadowed him in the studio. John Lennon, once admired, turned dismissive, leaving scars George never forgot. And it didn't stop with the Beatles. He openly mocked Neil Young's voice, accused Pete Townshend of false spirituality, dismissed Liam Gallagher as excess baggage, and even brushed off Elton John's chart-topping songs as formulaic. Yet, in the middle of all that criticism, George showed a surprising layer of care-like when he bluntly told Elton to cut down on drugs. That was George, cold at times, but also unflinchingly honest, even if it hurt. So what do these feuds really say about him? They reveal a man who valued sincerity above everything. George Harrison didn't want perfection, fame, or flattery. He wanted truth. And if he thought you were fake, shallow, or wasting your talent, he called it out. To some, that made him bitter. To others, it made him one of the rare voices in music who refused to play along with illusions. What do you think? Was George Harrison simply holding grudges, or was he standing for something deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next untold story from music's golden age.